Hi friends, it's a Wednesday evening and I had my psychology study group last night, and the book we were looking at is this one, The Divided Self by R.D. Laing. Interesting book, very interesting character. This is going to be my reaction to what I've studied this week and what I learned last night. This book appears in the list of 50 psychology classics that was put together by Tom Butler Bowden for one of the big publishers in the UK, and it also appears in lots of people's top 20 lists as the most important books dealing with psychology in the 20th century. So, interesting character. He actually got struck off what we call in the UK. He got removed as a doctor from the register. Well, you'll find out at the end. So this is going to be the usual audio recording. I've just introduced it on video, and it'll appear at some point in the future as a bonus episode between seasons on the Bible Project Daily podcast. Anyway, I hope you find it interesting, and I'll see you again sometime soon. Bye-bye for now. Hi friends, this week I've been studying and reading a book called The Divided Self by R.D. Laing in preparation for our psychology study group meeting. Completely secular group of people. I'm only a Christian who attends, but I've studied this book this week and the life of Laing, and I'd like to do a sort of Christian response and reaction to what I've learned. So we'll start, as I usually do, with a short biography of Laing. Ronald David Laing, also known as R.D. Laing, that's what he's mainly called, you can certainly describe him as a pioneering Scottish psychiatrist and psychoanalyst whose work at the time, particularly in the 1960s here and in the USA, deeply challenged traditional psychiatric approaches, and his influence in the field of psychology continues to this day. He was actually born in 1927 in Glasgow, Scotland, and he grew up in a working class family in what he later came to realise having a seriously mentally ill and some would say abusive mother. Yet he still managed to excel academically at primary school, and later he attended the Hutchesons Grammar School and then on to the University of Glasgow where he studied medicine. After completing his medical training, Laing actually served in the British Army as a medical officer before focusing in and pursuing further studies in psychiatry, and he did that at the Glasgow Royal Mental Hospital in Scotland. And it was during this time he began to develop his own groundbreaking ideas about the nature of mental illness and its treatment. In 1960, he published what has become his seminal work, The Divided Self. He actually wrote the book a few years later. When he was 28, he worked on this, which is quite impressive, really. And anyway, the book was published in 1960, and it was subtitled An Existential Study in Sanity and Madness. In this book, which has become a sort of standard of psychology, certainly historically anyway, Laing argued that schizophrenia and other forms of mental illness were not simply biological disordered, but were deeply rooted in social and interpersonal dynamics. He challenged the prevailing psychiatric orthodoxy of his day, which kind of believed that there was something wrong with the structure and function of the brain, by rather suggesting that the symptoms of mental illness could be understood as meaningful, even perhaps understandable responses to dysfunctional family dynamics and societal pressures. Now, Laing's ideas at that time and to this day sparked controversy within the psychiatric community, but they also resonated with many who themselves had experienced mental illness firsthand. He became associated with what was known as the anti-psychiatry movement, which sought to reform or even abolish traditional psychiatric institutions and practices. Throughout his career, Laing explored the complex interplay between individual psychology, social structures in society, and also these existential concerns he had. He wrote other books and numerous articles on topics such as family therapy, the nature of identity, the experience of madness, including probably his most famous work, other than The Divided Self, The Politics of Experience in 1967, and the book Knots in 1970. But he was no doubt most famous for his first book, The Divided Self, as I say, published in 1960 when he was only 32. Now, in addition to his academic work, Laing was deeply involved in therapeutic practice. He worked with individuals and families to explore the underlying causes of the emotional distress that people, particularly with schizoid type conditions, were experienced. He was based in America for quite a while, and while there he co-founded the Philadelphia Association, an organization dedicated to providing alternative approaches to mental health care. Despite his controversial ideas and, as we shall discover, his unconventional methods, Laing remained a highly influential figure in the field of psychology right up until his death in 1989. His legacy does continue to introduce psychologists, therapists, and even activists who seek to understand and address the complexities of the human experience of what we might call mental suffering. So the book itself. In this book, R.D. Laing delves into the very complex and difficult nature of mental illness, particularly schizophrenia, from a perspective that challenged the traditional psychiatric paradigms of his day. Laing's central thesis in this book seems to revolve around the idea that schizophrenia is not just a biological disorder, as many believed at that time, but rather a profound response to difficult, here's the rub friends, family and societal dynamics. You see, with Laing, you really can't blame it all on your mother. Anyway, here in my opinion are the main themes of his book. I'll actually comment more in detail about my perspective on all of this from a Christian point of view. Laing, first of all, drew heavily from existential philosophy, and that is one of the core themes of the book. He was influenced and quotes people like Heidegger, Kierkegaard, and Sartre, and he emphasizes the importance throughout of authenticity and the search for meaning in anyone's existence. And he suggests that individuals who are labelled as schizophrenic may in fact be experiencing a crisis of identity and authenticity and are just struggling to reconcile their inner experiences with the demands and expectations of the eternal world. Which leads us down the other path of his focus, which was interpersonal family dynamics in relation to mental illness. Laing extensively explored the role of family dynamics and, he said, perpetuation of schizophrenia. He argued that dysfunctional family relationships, those characterized by communication breakdowns or emotional repression and suppression, and the invalidation of individuals' experiences, all of these can contribute to the fragmentation of the self in the mental sufferer and facilitated the emergence of psychotic symptoms. However, in my estimation, this of course now is seen to fall way short, as it doesn't take into account at all what we know today about the generic components of such conditions as mental illness, as well as their biological makeup. He also focused on not just the family, but the wider social alienation that people with mental illness experienced and the cultural context in which we were raised. The book critiques the dehuman aspects of what he saw as modern society, highlighting the alienation and the existential angst experienced by many individuals. Laing actually suggests that schizophrenia can be understood as a response to this profound disconnection and the meaningless prevalent in much of contemporary culture. Remember, he's writing in the late 50s, so quite prophetic in some respects. He actually believed that madness was a sort of subjective experience. Through his case studies, actually recorded in this book, he provides vivid descriptions of the subjective experiences of madness of some of his patients and the people who stayed in one of his treatment communities. The whole focus of it is about challenging readers to empathise with individuals labelled as schizophrenic or any other mental health condition, and to recognise the validity of their inner worlds. He argued that psychotic symptoms such as delusions, hallucinations, can be understood as meaningful attempts to cope with overwhelming emotional distress and existential confusion. Throughout the book, he continually criticises traditional psychiatry. He offers a scathing critique of all the traditional psychiatric approaches, which he views as reductionist and dehumanising, believing that the approach taken often means that practitioners simply take complex phenomena in front of them and break them down to their constituent parts in isolation and don't see the whole, what we would today call holistic person. He was, in fact, in fairness to him, one of the first to call for a more compassionate and holistic understanding of mental health, one that indeed takes into account social, cultural, and the existential dimensions of the human experience. But let me for a moment examine Laing's theories through a Christian lens, so to speak. When you approach it from a Christian, you might even say just from a philosophical perspective, well, his ideas, his thinking, both offer us points of resonance as well as points of great tension. So here's my basic analysis, focusing on some of the key issues that he perpetuated, but looking at them from a Christian perspective. We can superficially find real areas of resonance in his writing. We can think of it alongside Christian themes of compassion and understanding. Laing's emphasis on sympathy, kindness, and understanding in his approach to mental illness aligns, of course, with Christian values, core values of love and compassion, particularly for the marginalised and suffering. However, his rejection absolutely of objective truth, we as Christians believe, dilute any hope of any sort of transformative experience, particularly that of the transformative power of Christ's love. Jesus exemplified compassionate care for the marginalised, but at the same time he also proclaimed, I am the way, the truth and the life, in John 14:6, underscoring for us as Christian believers the inseparable connection between truth, yes, scientific truth, yes, on one hand, but also expressed always in and through love. From a Christian perspective, his rejection of prejudice and the stigmatization of the mentally ill, along with this call for a more compassionate understandings of what the individuals who experience mental distress are going through, of course that resonates with Christ's teaching to love one another and care for the vulnerable on a superficial level. So while Laing's insights into the role of family dynamics in mental illness highlight the importance of interpersonal relationships, his perspective completely neglects the biblical framework of familial responsibility and accountability. The Bible admonishes parents to bring their children up in the training and instruction of the Lord, emphasizing the significance, yes, of nurturing within healthy family environments, but they must be grounded in faith as well as love. However, we can say his prophetic critique of materialism and the alienation it leads to, and the way it disconnects people from the authentic human personal relationships, deeply resonates with the Christian critique of the secular society and the dehumanizing effects of consumerism. From a Christian perspective, the emphasis on the importance of authentic relationships and the rejection of holding a purely materialistic worldview can absolutely be seen as consistent with the Christian belief. Grounded, of course, in the inherent dignity and value of every human being as created in the image of God. Laing's exploration, where he stepped into this territory of what you might call philosophical or even existential themes, such as the search for meaning, such as the search for authenticity, and the experience of angst that many of his patients suffered, can be lined up to an extent alongside the Christian existentialist thinkers like Soren Kierkegaard. From a Christian perspective, the acknowledgement of the dimension of human existence and experience absolutely makes sense with our understanding as Christian believers of the human condition as one marked ultimately for a longing with other people, yes, but that is only the earthly model of that which exists in heaven itself, which is a longing for communion with God itself and a struggle to find Him and meaning in the fallen world. However, his emphasis on this idea of individual autonomy and self-determination overlooks the transcendent dimension of the human existence and experience. Christianity teaches that true fulfillment is found in surrendering to God's will rather than pursuing those self-centered, self-regarding desires that Laing focused on. Jesus instructed, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me," emphasizing the importance of denial of self and self-denial in the pursuit of authentic meaning, not just chasing your own inner self. Laing's critique of traditional psychiatric approaches, as he saw at that time, today, not just by Christians, are viewed by many practicing psychologists today as somewhat simplistic. Some would say that his work and his approach were also dehumanizing to an extent because there was a tendency for him to reduce human beings to mere objects or mere problems to be solved by nature of the way he practiced it and the lack of oversight in these communities that he set up. Laing, of course, would totally reject the idea of original sin, instead of which he chose to raise questions about the balance between understanding mental illness and recognizing objective scientific realities. However, in contrast, Christianity at core acknowledges our fallen state, the fallen nature of humanity, and the need for discernment in addressing mental illnesses. The Apostle Paul advises to, when approaching everything, test everything, but yet hold fast to what is good. So yes, it advocates for a critical evaluation of a situation, but at the same time, it is underpinned and maintained by holding a fidelity to a ultimate external truth. Of course, from a Christian perspective, his call for a more holistic understanding of mental illness, one that takes into account the spiritual, social, and the real existential dimensions of the human existence, are totally consistent with the Christian emphasis on the integral nature of the human as a whole person. However, there's a real tension here between Laing's view and certain aspects of Christian theology. For example, while Laing emphasized the importance of subjective experience and the validity of these individual personal narratives that people carried, no matter how delusional or how much they were based on false thoughts, tend to clash with a Christian theology which, on the other hand, strongly affirms the existence of an objective truth and the importance of moral and spiritual realities beyond just our subjective perception, particularly a perception that may be temporarily twisted or damaged by, on one hand, extreme depression, or on the other hand, an episode of accelerated manic psychosis. Laing actually went so far as to reject most of the traditional psychiatric categories that existed that time, and that in itself, for many within psychology, would be problematic, and from those approaching these matters from outside, from a Christian understanding, would say that at core we can accept the reality of objective moral and spiritual truths when they're presented in front of it. Because for us, the existence of an objective truth is rooted in God's nature. Jesus himself, as I said, declared, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," ultimately affirming the fact that there is an object reality of truth existing in him. So, making some final comments about this guy, probably his most controversial assumption was that his belief that a child would have a predisposition to schizophrenia, and there may indeed be ways in which the mother, usually the mother, or the father, or even the wider family, the way they act can encourage or prevent children from developing normally and the schizophrenia, the underlying schizophrenic condition, being suppressed. Unsurprisingly, this angered parents of schizophrenic who felt he tried to lay the blame at their feet. Of course, to give him his fair due, the most lasting effect of the book was in some way it helped lift the taboo around mental illness and created a better understanding of how people in a delusional mind state or psychosis can be helped and supported. Laing saw a different route really for his patients, which was not to try and return them and fit them in to a society in which his patients would see things as differently. He started these communities in which patients were not detained. Nurses, doctors, patients all lived together side by side. But later research and evidence has shown that in these open institutions, if you like, that he created, particularly one in London, that probably only a third of the people there had a genuine mental illness like schizophrenia or what today we would recognize as bipolar disorder. Probably another third of the patients were there purely because they wished to take advantage and express, how shall we say it, flamboyant and eccentric art and creative work, along with a large portion of people who just wanted to live there to have open and free access to LSD and other experimental drugs. It was because of this out-of-the-box approach by Laing that, of course, he created a great deal of social currency in the 1960s and amongst the hippie culture. He became famous because his ideas were attracted to anyone, not just with mental illness, but anyone who felt marginalized by their family or by the culture around them. So it became part of this self-realization mindset of the sort of human potential movement of the 1960s. In these centers where people were gathered together, drug use was allowed and in fact encouraged. Interestingly for me, in researching this talk, I came across a 1986 interview on the BBC Radio 4 website in which Laing, his mid-60s, was interviewed by another very well-known British-based psychiatrist called Dr. Anthony Clare. The name of the programme was In the Psychiatrist's Chair. On that he spoke openly about his childhood, the abuse he suffered, also about his drug use, his alcohol addiction, which he still was in the midst of at that time, openly talking about the fact that he drunk himself to oblivion most evenings and then still continued to work as a practicing psychiatrist and psychologist at what was then a forerunner to the now infamous Tavistock Centre. Look that one up if you've got a moment. But interestingly, someone listened to that radio interview, a doctor listened to it in 1986 and reported him to what is called the General Medical Council, who upon listening to the interview forced him to resign from the UK's medical registers of doctors in 1987. He was effectively what we call struck off as a practicing doctor. His own drug use, his alcohol addiction, the fact that he himself was clinically depressed, and his ever-increasing interest in unorthodox subjects, such as treating people by using shamanism, reincarnation, all contributed to the lowering of his professional reputation in the last few years of his life. But, despite critics and the very many reasonable attempts to devalue his work, his main twin aim of changing attitudes to mental illness and the idea that he wanted to recast the ultimate aim of psychiatry away from controlling people to allowing people to live in a state of less mental suffering, it is for that which his influence has remained. Some say he is one of the top 4 major figures of 20th century psychology. So in conclusion, a critical analysis of his work from a Christian philosophical perspective reveals, yes, there are points of agreement, but also great tension. We can look at his emphasis on compassion, empathy, and the spiritual dimensions of human existence, and that, of course, all aligns with our Christian values, even if he's approaching it from a totally different place, and his rejection of traditional psychiatric approaches at that time, which were often seen as cold, hard, and controlling. with sometimes little evidence-based treatments, sometimes treatments which, although dramatic, had little evidence-based behind them. But of course his relativistic tendencies must raise concerns from a Christian perspective, and the nature of the fact that he questioned the very basis of morality and truth as being part of the human condition. But it's only by approaching these books, if I feel, from a Christian perspective, from a biblical perspective, can you be given the insight to discern the strengths and the weaknesses and the limitation of Laing's worldview and theories. There are certain aspects that we can integrate into our insights as to how we can help people who are suffering from psychological or mental trauma. But we can really only help people, support people, encourage people by having that underpinning of a robust Christian framework that is rooted in the person of Christ, in our interpersonal relationships with everyone we come into contact with, not just the mentally ill. I'll leave it there. Thanks for joining me today.